Japan for the most part isn't racist, but the vast majority is very much prejudiced. Welcome back to Kairu Rider on this rainy Friday in the Japanese mountains. Quick thanks from our sponsors, the subscribe and like button. But as for my question mark of a title, Japan is not racist, but it is very prejudiced. The difference is racism entails a feeling of hatred, and the vast majority of Japanese people do not really have hatred in their hearts unless they're in charge of writing history textbooks. Prejudice is something everybody has, which is a preconceived notion of what someone is based on their background. And everyone has prejudice, but in Japan, it is rampant and overwhelming. To some extent, I can empathize where they're coming from. If the only foreigners you've ever met were the ALT English teachers in your school, and all your English teachers tell you you have to learn English because no one can learn Japanese, and then during this recent 2020-2021 Olympics, the Japanese government ran ads saying, try to speak English to everyone that doesn't look like us because no one can learn Japanese and that's how we help. Well then, can you be surprised that when you speak Japanese but you look like me or any other kind of Westerner, the Japanese person might panic and force English? Not because they hate you, they've never seen anything like you in their life. When the vast majority of your conversations involve the phrase, you are English teacher? It's not because they think that's where you belong. They have no idea that 99% of us will not be welcomed in most employment places because of our color or where we're from, regardless of language abilities. That's just because everyone they meet that doesn't look Asian is almost always an English teacher. When they ask you, when are you leaving? It's not because they want you to leave. It's because everyone leaves. They don't realize everyone leaves because we can't get normal jobs and everyone asks us when we're leaving as if we shouldn't be here. They're just curious and trying to be friendly the only way they know how. It's not hateful racism, but it's definitely prejudice, the extreme prejudice I've gone through. The majority of places I've tried to rent have said no foreigners. Assume 1% of foreigners leave the last month without paying their final rent or their move-out fee. 1% of foreigners are a bit too loud, which you might be quiet by an Australian or a US American standard, but by Japanese standards, you're still loud. Let's say 1% is unclean or unfriendly. By the rate of immigration this country has, be it little, that's still tens of thousands of terrible renters. You can kind of understand the risk that they're running when they have almost no risk renting only to Japanese people. It makes sense that I have no idea the word for immigrant in Japanese. I only know the word gaijin for outsider or gaikokujin, foreign person, which is polite outsider. And the reason I do not know the word for immigrant, almost no one ever meets a real immigrant, because I just met my first real immigrant in Japan who became a Japanese citizen 2 weeks ago after 4 years living here, almost 2 in Tokyo. Most Japanese, like most Americans, like most French people, like most anyone, have no idea what it entails to be a proper immigrant, what it takes to actually get citizenship. You have to renounce your citizenship to become Japanese. Unlike Spain, the Japanese government will check that you truly gave up everything for this country, so that people can continue to ask you, when are you leaving now that you can't? Most jobs said no to me before an interview. I've applied to several jobs recently. All they asked for was my name and my email address. Unless they have a severe issue with people that use Gmail, I've got to assume it's the fact that I had to write my name in the foreign alphabet of katakana. It might not be hatred. It might just be, oh no, this guy probably doesn't speak Japanese, but I have had interviews that have gone on for 30 minutes and then they say gaijin in a pretty mean way can never learn Japanese, so your people can't work here. And then I have to wonder, what was the last half hour? So when I say that we're often extremely unemployable, especially outside of Tokyo, there is definitely a hate portion to it. There is definitely a mistrust to it, but a big part of it when you get into bigger jobs, they don't necessarily trust the quality of Western work or non-Japanese work. Look at this list that ranks bikes by maintenance issues over the course of 5 years. Top 4, all Japanese. A so-so second place for American bikes, and then Europeans trail. You do not see Indian and Chinese bikes on the list. Period. So when Japanese are mistrusting of us, in their heads, there's nowhere to go but down. That reliability gap extends way beyond just bikes. All forms of technology are like that. And one thing you have to think about is, what is the failure? I looked a little bit into it with Yamaha because it surprised me that 13% of Yamahas will fail in 5 years. Well, it's because Yamaha uses so much cheap plastic. The cheap plastic cracks or something like that. It's not even a failure, it's a nothing. When you look at BMW warranty claims, there are going to be foreigners in the comments, and if you've been here, foreigners you know that say they've never experienced racism in Japan, they've never seen it. And they fall into one of two categories. A, they are wearing Asian camouflage. Of course, they don't get called out on a daily basis. Or B, they're liars. And I know people like this. I've seen it happen to them, and they continue saying it doesn't happen. And the longer you get to know them, eventually they are telling stories when it happens to them. The reason, in my opinion, they're not lying to you. They're lying to themselves because they like Japan so much, so they're trying to justify staying here, but they feel like they are an outsider and they have no voice where they're allowed to actually say, hey, I'm French. I don't really speak English very well, but my Japanese is amazing. You give me notes in English, I don't know what to do at work today. As much as this may surprise my Japanese viewers, I know off the top of my head 4 people that are black or white, no or next to zero English, far worse than the average Japanese person, but their Japanese is about as fluent as you can get without being born here. So when you force English, it's like you're yelling at a Japanese person in English. And as far as the racism that happens, that is genuinely a somewhat hateful thing, comment below how many bars you think I have been not allowed entry because of them yelling no gaijin, and I'll give you a hint. The answer is not 0. But I know what you're asking. Hey, Kairyu Rider, if it's that dehumanizing, why do you stay? Well, there's a million reasons. We could talk about trains, healthcare, food quality, but at the end of the day, actual hateful prejudice that's derailed my entire day, I get way more hate from left-leaning white people than I do from Japanese people. It's weird. And of course, I look forward to your comments. But the more pertinent question is, will the prejudice in Japan get better? And if so, how? I've lived in Osaka, a small town in Nagano, and I live in Tokyo. Tokyo is almost a westernized city as far as its openness to diversity. When I'm in the actual city of Tokyo, it's very rare that people treat me as an other. Out at bike meets in the Kanto area, the majority of people treat me like a fellow biker. It's still far from perfect. There's still plenty of places that won't rent, plenty of places that won't hire me, and there are people that have issues with me the further I get from the city center, and I just cannot go to a tourist area and assume I will hear Japanese. I'm the wrong color. Always. My wife and I often feel trapped in Tokyo. The odds of me having the same quality of life, or even 80% the same quality of life outside of Tokyo, are extremely low. Now, I must say, in my opinion, I do believe it's getting better, but there are 2 things that need to happen to really improve the issues with prejudice in Japan. And I know, as of 2016, the opinions of a straight white male are instantly considered hate speech. I'm sorry for my birth. Good thing YouTube got rid of the thumbs down button counter. But for those of you that don't think my race and gender are my single biggest failings in life, my first solution is to foreigners. You need to stop lying. When you're asked by a Japanese person, do you like living in Japan? Don't say, yes, it's perfect, while working a job that drains you of your soul and makes you want to die. Tell them, it's great, but there's a lot of issues. Remind them, most foreigners leave Japan, and there's reasons. Nobody's saying, boy, this is paradise, better go back to hell. For the English teachers, tell people, for the vast majority of us, the only reason we teach English is because no one else will hire us. Regardless of language ability, if you don't live in Tokyo and have a near native level, there's no good jobs. And say people like Kairyu Rider got out of English teaching because they have an incredibly supportive Japanese wife and a marriage visa. I know people who do not have permanent residence and do not have a marriage visa, but got out of teaching. They are an extreme hyper minority. If I say they're 1%, they're not. They're less. And the vast majority of that started their own cafe or something. Goodbye, Mr. Police. And don't be afraid to tell them that when it comes to renting, most won't even see you. Those that do will very often add special fees for you and your foreign self. Most importantly, when you're speaking Japanese and they speak back in English, ask them why they did that. Keep playing the why game till they finally admit, your skin color makes me uncomfortable, or I think people that look like you cannot handle learning our language. Once they've admitted whatever form of prejudice they do in fact have, explain to them the reason we're so bad at Japanese. When we try to practice, most Japanese speak back in English. We are not allowed to practice. Remind them that everyone they know that went to the USA to learn English, when they spoke English, even terrible English, we don't speak back in broken Mandarin just because they're Asian. We don't speak to black people in French. In Japan, speak Japanese to Japanese speakers and tell them if they actually think that they like foreigners and they want foreigners in their country, they have to help us. Speaking English is never helpful when we're trying to learn and practice Japanese. You don't speak English to a Japanese child who makes a mistake in Japanese. That would be weird. So why are you doing it to us? And I can already hear you typing. I know so many people that say, oh, it's not that big a deal, it's not worth the fight. Because in the immortal words of Martin Luther King, fuck it, let it go. Go to your own toilets. Am I misquoting? Now the second solution, much more difficult, asking Japanese people to do better in TV and entertainment. When you see, for example, having a piece about this foreign thing or this foreign culture piece, don't just ask a bunch of Japanese people who've never been where you're talking about. Have someone on the show from there and have them speak Japanese about the subject. There's plenty of us that can fill the role, especially in Tokyo. And most importantly, this may be a shock to many of you, when we are interviewed, we are edited to make it look funny. They will force us to use English because it sounds better. They will force us to say watashi ha instead of watashi wa because it makes us look silly instead of like people. Don't censor us for your most fragile audience member. That's YouTube's job. There's a new movie coming up with mixed kids in it, which is awesome. But you need more movies, more dramas, more TV shows where there are Westerners speaking Japanese, not the traditional doofy-looking English teacher who has no idea what's going on and seems like they can't even tie their own shoes. Have someone like me, who was a mechanic, play the part of a mechanic. Don't even have me talk. Just have me be the guy who's casually changing oil in the background. Have the post-delivery person be someone who is black. You only have to teach them, shimasen, yubin desu, something like a school meeting scene. Have one Western parent in the school meeting, really briefly, and not waiting for the Japanese English teacher to terribly mistranslate what they say. And that's it. No major activism, no protest, no big movement, no special march, no new law. Have people that look like us do the same thing Japanese people do so that it becomes normal. But with that being said, foreigners, remember, hatred only breeds more hatred. And I am not your role model. But before I go, I will give you a quick bonus to the Japanese viewers among you. もし外国人は喋りたい。でも多分その人は日本語わからない。まだ知らない。やってみる。簡単日本語。こんにちは。失礼します。その外国人は日本語喋るか Sorry, do you speak English? か No Japanese. その英語言った？英語でもいい。でももし日本語喋る？あなたも日本語だけお願いします。英語は邪魔。もしまだ日本語は上手じゃない、まだ日本語だけ。例えば日本人子供は日本語を間違えたある？どうする？英語喋る？違う。日本語で直する。外国人と同じする。僕たちは英語の先生だけじゃない。でももしその外国人は英語の先生、今は仕事中じゃない？日本語勉強したい。日本語練習したい。英語は全然やめてください。最後は、私の日本語はまだ上手じゃない。もし私は10歳日本人、まだ 40% だけ完璧。めっちゃ悪い。僕の文法、言葉はいっ ぱいわかんない。でも練習はいつも大変。いつも間違えたみんなは英語を喋りたい。日本人は日本語上手って言うと、僕の日本語ぐらいは上手じゃない。その意味は日本語上手じゃない。その意味はやっぱり外人の日本語はいつも悪い。でもお前が 100% ゴミじゃない。でも少し頑張ろう、アホ外人。でも皆様、このビデオを見てたありがとうございました。私は海流ライダー。でも私の名前は外国人スペルできない。と日本人のコメントはまだ英語。